Well, we're continuing our studies in this Sunday morning class on some lessons that all are on the theme of personal godliness. Now, we're nearing the end of that study, and so we'll have to come up with our new plan right away, but we're on lesson 12 of 13. If you're looking at your study guide, look at lesson 12. If you don't have that, you'll certainly be able to follow along in the scriptures that we'll be referencing. This lesson has to do with godliness in suffering and conflict. Now, that's kind of an interesting thing that our author picked that out as a subject necessary to deal with. I don't know if I would have thought of that, but I think it is certainly an appropriate thing because our lives have suffering and conflict. And if we are godly people in the midst of suffering and conflict, we want to stay focused on God. That's what we have said throughout our study. We have said that godliness is focus on God, a God-pointedness. Our lives are constantly aiming toward God. So what do I do when I suffer? I want to stay focused on God. What do I do if there's conflict? I want to stay focused on God. And so this is certainly, I think, an appropriate subject in this broader theme of personal godliness. He says in the introduction, and I think this is a very common but mistaken idea, if I'm doing right and if I'm living right, then everything about my life will go smoothly. And that being the case, if everything right now is going smoothly in my life, then I conclude that I must be right with God because everything's going. On the other hand, if things are not going so well in my life, if there's sickness or if there's some trouble of one sort or another going on in my life, then people mistakenly, I think, conclude that means God's mad at me. God must be mad at me. And that's why this sickness has hit and so forth. Those things are not necessarily true. The fact of the matter is that godly people do suffer in this present world. And if you would even think to doubt that truth, think about Jesus Christ, the only perfect individual who ever lived, and look at the trouble that was in his life. And so godly people do suffer. So suffering and trouble in one's life, that's not the gauge. That's not how we determine whether or not we're living appropriately, living godly lives. So in the first part of the outline, our author deals with problems godly people suffer. And he asks us to list some common problems which godly people will escape. List some common problems which godly people will escape. Now think about that. Go to Exodus. The verse he references is Exodus 15. In Exodus chapter 15, verse 26, it says, "If thou wilt diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, and will do that which is right in his sight, and will give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon thee, which I have brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord that healeth thee." Oh, now wait a minute. I thought we just said that freedom from disease is not guaranteed, but that says that there's some diseases we won't have if we live godly lives. So what's the right picture here? Am I going to be kept free from sickness if I'm living right or not? What is the right conclusion, Tom?
If you look back at that concept of, it isn't even referring to those plagues that he brought upon the Egyptians because they wouldn't, do what God asked them to do.
Yeah.
Sometimes, the way that, the Bible is written, people take and interpret it out of context. But in the context, I think he's sort of referring to those plagues. You do what I say, I'm not going to bring these same things on you that I brought on them. So they're turning away from God.
Yeah, I do think that that's the immediate context here of the specific kind of plagues that he brought upon the Egyptians. But I actually think that there is at least a limited sense in which if I'm living a godly life, there are some things that I don't have to worry about. I don't have to worry about alcoholism if I'm living a godly life. I don't have to worry about sexually transmitted diseases if I'm living a godly life. So there are some categories of disease that we're protected from because we live godly lives. That goes to us living the lifestyle that God mandates. And if we live the lifestyle that God for instance, are you worried about contracting AIDS? Well, that is not even on my radar screen. Now, I understand that there are some instances where people might get AIDS through a blood transfusion or some other way. That's been pretty well mitigated. And typically, that's not even something we worry about anymore. But that if we live like God says, there are some. It won't keep us from all disease. Because the fact of the matter is, we're all ultimately going to get old and sick and die. If something doesn't take us before that, something will ultimately take us. If the Lord doesn't return first, something's going to cause us to die. We understand that. But there is some actual comfort in knowing that there are at least a category of diseases that I don't have to worry about if I'm living the life that God wants me to live. Let's look at 1 Peter 4, verse 15. 1 Peter 4:15. Let none of you suffer as a murderer or as a thief or as an evildoer or as a busybody in other men's matters. Yet if any man suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed but glorify God on this behalf. So here's another category of things that I don't have to worry about. I don't have to worry about suffering that would come to me because I'm a murderer or a thief or an evildoer, right? So if I live the way God says, it won't keep all trouble out of my life, but it will keep a category of things out of my life. There's certain diseases, there's certain problems, there's certain conflicts that I'll be free from if I'm living the way that God says I should live. He mentions some historic people who were delivered from trouble. And I don't know if we need to take the time to read all of this, but in 2 Peter chapter 2, at verse 5, it says, God spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. Noah was delivered. You talk about hard times. You talk about difficult times. We don't know anything to what Noah was dealing with, and yet God delivered Noah. God protected and delivered Noah even in the worst possible of times. And then verse 7 of that same text, he says he delivered just Lot. Lot was in Sodom. Sodom, an incredibly wicked place. God delivered Lot from the punishment that came upon Sodom. So, God can and does protect His righteous people from certain things. Okay? We got to really qualify that by saying not everything. There's no promise that He'll deliver us from every sickness or from every kind of trouble. But the fact of the matter is, we have a leg up on the people of the world who are not living for God in regards to at least some categories of sickness and trouble. Tom?
He doesn't do it in the time frame that we're looking for. Look at Joseph. I mean, just, sold into slavery. Looks like, all things working out for him. He gets in Potiphar's house. He has that. He's put back in prison. He gives the thing. He gets the butler, out. He gets forgotten about. He's still there in prison. Then he comes out, and finally God delivers him. Job, inflicted with all kinds of things and loss of his family, all the way up. But at the end, God delivers him. Yeah. The book of Revelation talks about us, about all the things that's going on. Keep focused. The end is, there. You've got the promise. God wins.
Yeah. Our problem is, like you said, we sort of got tunnel vision. We're looking at right now, here and now. Whereas we got to see the big picture, and that's the harder thing to do. When you're in immediate crisis or immediate sickness, it's hard to see the big picture. But we got to stay focused on the big picture, Tom.
Even the children of Israel, 400 years down in Egypt, enslaved, basically, given
Yeah.
whatever the time frame comes up. From the time of Joseph, really up until, Moses comes on the picture. There, and the concept there was they were God's people, but they didn't really know who God was in a lot of ways. They had to be, reminded who He was, what He did, what He's capable of, which are, reminders that we need all the time as well.
Yeah. Okay, Tina?
We diseases like other people, cancer, things like that happen, and we can really use that as an opportunity to let our light shine too. Even though we're, suffering through these things, sometimes your actions, your attitudes teach just as much to unbelievers about your faith in God. I believe is sitting down and opening the scriptures, and I'm not diminishing that. I'm just saying that by the way that we handle things, instead of blaming God or why me or whatever, we can just as much teach about our faith and trust in the Lord for those.
So you're saying in the instances where we're not spared from sickness and conflict, we can still let our light shine. I think you're exactly right. He says, can we hope for deliverance on these kind of occasions? Yes, but always no, right? There is deliverance to God's people from some of that, not from all of that. He said, give an example. I wonder what you think about this. What would be an example of people who suffered because of the sins of others? Anything come immediately to mind? A biblical example of people who suffered because of the sins of others? Tom?
Basically, the children of Israel, Judah suffered because of the decision a lot of kings made. They were carried away into captivity. In a lot of ways there. You look at the time of the Judges, the children of Israel, were oppressed by, the Canaanites around them and things, and, the judge rose up and delivered them.
I was thinking specifically in those kinds of examples, I was thinking specifically of the children. Yeah. When God sent punishment on Israel and Judah, there were some infant children who were completely innocent, and yet they suffered consequence too. Many of them were killed. That might be a clear example of the fact sometimes good people, innocent people, suffer at the hands of others. And of course, the ultimate example again is Jesus. Wade? Okay, ultimate example is Jesus, right? Josh?
Wasn't it Achan that took some of the spoil of the battle, and then there was a lot of innocent people that didn't take spoil of the battle, but they died in the next battle because of his sin?
Yeah, the case of Achan is a good example. Carol?
Did you say that Adam suffered because of the sin of Eve when she...
Well, he was drawn into it. He sinned too. Yeah, he sinned too, but he got drawn into it, didn't he? Yeah, all right. All right, so it is a fact. It is a well-established biblical fact that we might suffer. We always come up with sort of hypothetical examples of how, we might suffer because someone else chose to sin. For instance, to me, sort of the classic example is you're driving home. You may have been to church services, and you're driving home from church services, and a drunk driver crosses the center line, hits you head on, leaves you paralyzed for the rest of your life. You didn't deserve that. I mean, that's not something that you got because you did wrong. It is clearly the case that sometimes innocent people suffer because of the sins of others. And we're not guaranteed. The emphasis of this whole section of the outline is we're not guaranteed that won't happen. It could happen. It very well could happen. He says, list some problems shared by everyone, godly or ungodly, international and national. Well, I think probably what comes to our mind there is wars. In our lifetimes, we've been pretty well protected from any of the horrible consequences of war, but you don't have to look very far in the world to see very much suffering that comes because of wars and conflict, international and national issues. Again, innocent people suffer. And you see those refugees who are just kind of carrying what they can on their backs as they flee from war zones. We've never known that in our lives. But that's an example of some people who are suffering, obviously, and not necessarily because of anything they did to deserve it. natural disasters. You know, we see earthquakes, we see hurricanes, we see all kinds of tornadoes, and that just leave devastation in their paths. Again, everybody. So, if you lived in South Florida, then you might be a very faithful Christian, trying very hard to do the right thing. And if a hurricane comes through there and hits where you live, your neighbor next door to you, who is the most ungodly person in the whole community, his house gets blown down. But your house gets blown down too. You're not protected from that, right? That's not a guarantee that we have. On the job, he mentions, if the economy goes south and jobs are lost, a Christian might suffer that just as much as a non-Christian would. In the neighborhood, if there's an explosion of crime in the neighborhood, you might suffer that along with everybody else. Or in our personal lives, I think the thing that comes to mind about our personal lives is some form of sickness. So you get some kind of sickness, maybe a life-threatening sickness. That just happens. Godly and ungodly people suffer those kind of things. Now, so there's some things that everybody's going to suffer. We are, because we're trying to live godly lives, we're protected from some of that. But actually, because we're trying to live godly lives, some additional things may come upon us that don't come upon people of the world. For instance, 1 Peter 4, verse 4. 1 Peter 4, verse 4. They think it strange that you run not with them to the same excessive riot, speaking evil of you. Oh, the people of the world think you're some kind of a weirdo. They speak evil of you because you don't do the same kind of stuff they do. You don't go out drinking and carousing, And so the people of the world say, well, you're just some kind of religious fanatic freak. You're just some kind of Jesus freak. You're just some kind of a weirdo. Well, that's not pleasant. I'll tell you, when that sort of thing happens, it's not pleasant. We open ourselves up to that. In other words, here's a category of things that might happen to us that don't happen to everybody else. But because we're living godly lives, we open ourselves up to that sort of ridicule and even persecution. Luke chapter 6, verse 22. Luke 6:22, blessed are ye when men shall hate you, and when they shall separate you from their company, and shall reproach you and cast out your name as evil for the Son of Man's sake. Oh, wow. Jesus said it could happen, right? And I think he's actually not only saying it could happen, but predicting it will happen. And that if we remain faithful, we'll be blessed because we withstood that sort of thing. But persecution and ridicule, certainly. Now, do we want it? Are we some kind of people who rejoice in being mistreated? We love to be persecuted. In fact, we look for opportunities for people to belittle us and put us down and ridicule. No. Well, we're not looking for it. Nobody says it's pleasant. But we have actually opened ourselves up to that reality, again, by virtue of living godly lives. Jesus even suggested in Matthew chapter 10 that this kind of division, because we're trying to be faithful, could even infect families. Look in Matthew 10, beginning verse 21. The brother shall deliver up brother to death, and the father the child, and the children shall rise up against their parents and cause them to be put to death. And ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake, but he that endures to the end shall be saved. So, Jesus there said that this kind of conflict or division could seriously impact families. Even the point, that's hard for us to imagine, isn't it? Brother shall deliver up brother to death, and father the child, and the child shall rise up against their parents and cause them to be put to death. Now, I want to tell you something. I'm thankful we hadn't seen that in our place, in our time. But we know it's happened. And just to some extent, it's happening in places of the world even today. Why? because some are determined to live godly and others aren't. Dale?
Think about it. What did Jesus pray when he was in the garden? Those things were passed to him, so he didn't want it for himself.
No.
And, you know,
If he could have chosen, he wouldn't have gone through with that.
but he did.
But he accepted it. And that's what we've got to do. I think you're right. Exactly right. Wait.
So how would you interpret this passage along with what our discussion is? In Psalms 34, verse 19, it says, "Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of all of them. He keeps all his bones, not one of them is broken. Evil shall slay the wicked, and those who hate righteous will be condemned. The Lord redeems the soul of his servants, and none of those who take refuge in him will be condemned."
Yeah. I think the deliverance there, and it's somewhat figurative language, but I think the deliverance is, so you're going to have trouble in this world, but ultimately you are delivered and safe from that if you stay faithful to God. In other words, they might throw you in prison, or they might beat you with rods, like they did Paul, where we just studied in Philippi in our Wednesday night study. But ultimately you're safe and delivered because you are God's person. I think that's the way to take that. Because to take it otherwise, to say we would never have trouble of any kind if we're faithful, would contradict all these so many other places. So I think we have to take that in the spiritual sense. We are fully protected. If we live righteously, we are fully protected from harm in the spiritual sense. Did I see another hand? Anybody? Tom?
A lot of what Jesus said there, was coming apart, there, in his lifetime, there were those who would be sort of kicked out of the synagogue if they were, following him and what was happening. And his families were, oh, he's following Jesus. The leaders would kick him out. But then when the church was established, we see that going on daily. How did Paul go get these letters from the leaders, religious leaders in Jerusalem, to go all the way up to Damascus? Because people were
telling on their own.
Huh?
Some probably family members telling on their own family. Yeah, I think you're right. The last part of that section, according to 2 Timothy 3, verse 12, how universal will persecution be? Well, it'll be totally, completely universal. In other words, we're not going to escape it if we're living right. You know this verse, I think, pretty well. 2 Timothy 3:12, yea, and all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. And really, if you stop to think about it, that's a pretty good test. That's a pretty good self-test. If I can't identify anything that has happened in my life, negative treatment I've received, trouble I've had to endure, if I can't identify anything that has happened to me because I'm trying to live a righteous, godly life, then it may be a very good indication I'm not working it that hard enough. Because Paul's statement is all-encompassing. Yea, all who live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to be thrown in jail. It doesn't mean you'll be beaten with a whip or rods. It may just be that sort of ridicule that we talked about earlier. But if I can't identify anything that's ever happened in my life, unpleasant, negative, something that's happened in my life, because I'm a Christian now, I got to admit, and I think you would too, I've suffered negative, unpleasant things because I'm a weak sinner, right? And because of my own failures, I have brought certain negative things into my life, right? But if I can't identify anything negative or hurtful that's come into my life because I'm doing right, then maybe I'm not working hard enough at doing right. Because what Paul said, yea, all who will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. There's no exception there. And so again, I think that serves as a pretty good self-test. All right, any thoughts in that section? Anything we need to cover? The next section, he talks about human reactions. The first question, what are some human responses to the problems listed previously? Suffering that comes into our lives from one. No, he mentioned, remember we talked about international and national, maybe wars, natural disasters, problems on the job or with the economy, maybe crime in the neighborhood or sickness in my personal life. What are some human responses to those sort of things? Karen?
Sometimes people are very quick to blame God.
Exactly. And my guess is that's what our author was wanting us to dwell on right there. You know, that well, my dear loved family one got sick. Maybe he got sick and died. And I just don't know why God would do that to me. Or I was trying to do the right thing on my job, and my boss told me to lie for him, and I told him I couldn't lie for him. And he fired me. That just doesn't seem fair. Why is God doing this to me? I mean, how often have we heard that sort of, blaming God? Well, it's not, so if my boss fired me because I wouldn't lie for him, that's not God's fault that bad guy fired me. That's me suffering from the evil of another person. That doesn't have anything at all to do with God. God didn't cause that, and that's not to be put at His feet. Even sickness, as we said earlier, we understand we live in a world of sickness and death. We're going to get sick and we're going to die. That's just what's going to happen. We know that that's the case. And again, very often when people get sick, they want to blame God. But think about that. I mean, we know the realities. Why is it God's fault that the realities of living in this physical world come? If you want to go all the way back and blame where that blame really lies, blame Satan for bringing sin into the world, because physical death was one of the consequences of sin entering the world. Physical death was not in the world until sin came into the world. If you want to know how God wanted it, look at the Garden of Eden. Look at Adam and Eve in their initial existence in the Garden of Eden. God wanted everything perfect for us. Sin's what changed all that. And therefore, don't blame God, blame Satan, I think is a good observation. Does the fact that, the question is, does the fact that a response is human or natural make it right? Okay, so the economy goes terribly south. I mean, our national economy just collapses. Everybody loses their job. The shelves at the grocery store are bare. Well, most of the grocery stores aren't even open. You can't get food. You can't get basic necessities of life. Again, that seems so foreign to us. We've never known that, but there's places in the world like that. So, I know that my neighbor has got something, and I'm going to go over there and steal it from him. Because I got to eat. My family's got to eat. And so I'm going to go steal from someone who does have something to eat. Would that be just, and I think we all know, obviously, that is part and parcel of the argument of situation ethics, that right and wrong is determined by the situations you're in. That's just not so. Right is right and wrong is wrong, and the situation does not change that. So would it be a desperate, sad thing if I was starving and I couldn't feed my family? Absolutely, that'd be horrible. But it doesn't justify me, what? Losing my focus on God, right? Godliness, focusing on God. Dale?
Greg, I know a woman that one time she told me, she said, I worship the love of God, and He's never going to do something like that. So her son died, and she blamed God.
Sure.
She, look what He's done, but, there again, we have to think about
Yeah, I always want, when people do that, I always wonder, do they think you're going to live forever? So, my 90-something old mother gets sick and dies. And I'm mad at God about that. What did I think? Did I think that she's going to live forever? I mean, to me, that reaction is just totally unreasonable.
she was so mad, at God, that it ended up it broke her whole family.
Yeah.
That's what's so sad about it.
Yeah. All right, anybody else? Tom?
Think back in the Old Testament there when, Elijah and food, I'll just break it up. He went and asked her, she fixed me a, well, this is like, last meal, you know, my son and I were going to eat and die, but here, I'll help you out. And, you know, they just kept having food.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, that was, but
miraculous.
that was miraculous.
But it's a concept too, you know, if the guy would come to you and say, hey, you know, my family doesn't have any food, do you have anything to spare? More likely, we would try to work around and find something to do it. But when he comes in, breaks in and steals it from it, we feel violated, you know, our anger builds up against it because they did us some harm.
We have, I think you're right, we have lived in such a time of abundance. It's just mind-boggling, really, when you think of the abundance that we've had in the material world. I'm worried about myself, and I think all of us are worried about our nation, and all of us are worried about how it would turn out what if that changed? What if it did? What if the whole thing just fell in on itself? How would we react? I don't know. I know what we're supposed to do. And what we're supposed to do is be faithful to God. Stay focused on God. Because all of this, no matter what, all of this is temporal. This is not lasting, right? And so if it were to come very hard times, we got to stay focused on God. Tina?
So many times we as humans just are ready to throw logic out the window over emotion. And the sad thing is that it seems like that in God and religion, that's where we see it happening the most. It's like you can see logic in other things until it comes to that, and then it's just throw logic out the window, and it's whatever feels.
I know it. That is sad that when it comes to religious things, people don't even think logically, and you can't get them to. I think you're right. Tom?
We're in an age right now where probably most of the people alive today don't remember the Depression. We have history books that talk about it, but you read, you don't realize it. I can't imagine what things were like back during, you know, the 30s and 40s when, you know, basically there wasn't anything. I mean, people were out of jobs and, you know, crops weren't being grown.
They didn't have anything to eat.
Huh?
They went day by day worrying what they would have to eat. And we don't know that. We've never been around that. I don't know if I've ever told you a story before about my mom. This many years ago. We went to a family funeral, and the way out in the middle of nowhere country cemetery place went past the farm where my mom grew up, where I remember visiting my grandpa when I was just a little boy. We went past that farm. And my mom opened up. I never had heard her talk about such things. She said she remembered Depression days. She was a little girl. She was born in 23, so she would have been 7, 8, 9, years old when the main part of the Depression hit. She said that her mom would listen for the garbage truck from town. Their neighbor, the farm next to them, had hogs, and he would let the city bring the garbage truck out and dump the garbage in his fields, and then he let his hogs eat through it. She said when her mom heard that truck coming, she'd get her and her sisters together. They'd go up there and they'd go through that garbage. And they might find a part of an apple or a piece of a banana. And before the hogs could get to it, they would take those things. And she said we lived on that. I'll tell you, you talk about a heartbreaking story. We've never known times like that. But people have, and people are right now in places of the world dealing with that sort of hardship. How would we react in really hard times? I tell you, we need to make up our mind right now that we would stay faithful to God, that we would stay focused on God, because even if you had times that hard, it's not forever. It's all temporal. It's going to pass. Eternity's forever. Dale?
Lined up at the bottom, waiting for somebody to fall and die before they could possibly take their job. Now, that's pretty serious too.
That's bad, isn't it? Really bad times. I pray it doesn't happen. I really pray that we would never face those kind of hardships, because I don't know how well we'd hold up because we are so spoiled. We are so spoiled. I just hope that we could hold up if it did happen like that. Real quickly, on the second page of the lesson, how did Jesus react? What evidence do you see in Jesus or the apostles that they allowed international, national problems to distract them? Well, there's no indication at all, right? They were very hard times when Jesus was alive. The Romans and the Jews were at immense conflict during those times. No indication that Jesus ever got wound up about any of that or took a side or even paid attention to those sort of troubles. Why did Jesus say his servants would not fight to defend him? By the way, I think that's a typo there. That should be, instead of John 13, that should be John 18. Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight. But my kingdom is not from hence, he said. So, I mean, we don't fight. We don't come to physical arms to defend the kingdom of God. It's a whole different realm, obviously. And then he says, write out Peter's description of the example that Jesus left for us. And this is a text that we call to mind a lot at the time of the Lord's Supper. And it's really so poignant. 1 Peter 2, verse 22. Well, let's back up to verse 21. For even hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that ye should follow in his steps, who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth, who, when he was reviled not again, when he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judgeth righteously. You got to think about that, how Jesus dealt with being badly mistreated by the sinful people of the world. When he was reviled, he reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not. You remember when they came and took Jesus, and they would spit on him, and then they would slap him, and even taunted him by saying, tell us who it is who smote thee. Jesus didn't respond. He could have. He could have said, I know who you are. Your name's Joe Smith, and your daddy is Jack Smith, and he lives out on the Jericho Highway. And you, by the way, I'm going to make sure that you burn in the hottest part of hell for what you have done to me. Would it have been deserved? He didn't do that. When he was reviled, he reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not. But what did he do? He committed himself to the one who judges righteously. That's what we've got to do. Even in the face of horrible mistreatment, because we are living godly lives, we need to imitate Jesus in all of that. In doing so, we become partakers. The part B there. Of what nature are we partakers? 2 Peter 1 verse 4 says we become partakers of the divine nature. That's what we want, right? More and more, we want to be more like God, right? Partakers of the divine nature. That's what we want. Okay, last section. We're just about out of time, but the last section here. According to these scriptures, how will godliness affect our attitudes toward problems and conflicts? Well, let's start out. Several of these first ones are from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Let's look over there real quickly. Matthew 5, verse 10. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. So, how should we react when we get this kind of persecution and mistreatment? Jesus said there's even a basis for rejoicing in that, because we know that if we faithfully endure that, there's a reward in heaven. That's what he just said, right? Great is your reward in heaven. And then I always think the last part of that is also significant. For so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. When we suffer for righteousness' sake, we're joining in some really good company. If we get mistreated because we're trying to live godly lives, we're in there with Elijah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and Daniel, and Peter, James, and John, and Jesus himself, really, right? When we endure persecution for righteousness' sake, we are in some really good company, and that ought to mean something to us. When we suffer wrongfully, we actually become more and more like God. Still in Matthew 5, look at verses 43. Ye have heard that it had been said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and the unjust. So, we are like God. We become more and more like God when we suffer wrongfully and endure it. We won't take time to read the next passage, but I think you know it. Still in the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 6, beginning verse 25, he says, don't worry about what you're going to eat, what you're going to wear. God knows you have need of these things. Consider the lilies of the field. They toil not, neither do they spin. Yet Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these, Jesus said. So, just have confidence. God will provide. Certainly Romans 12 tells us that in the face of all of that potential mistreatment, don't become vengeful. Don't try to get even. Romans 12, beginning verse 17, recompense to no man evil for evil. Provide things honest in the sight of all men. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. The great temptation is, obviously, that guy did me wrong. I mean, he did me real dirty. And I'm going to get even with him. You just wait and see. He'll be sorry he ever did that to me, because I am going to make him pay. That's not godliness, right? That is not godliness. And so we have to fight that temptation. I think it's a natural temptation to feel that way, but we got to fight that temptation, right? Dale?
What did Jesus say when he was on the cross? Forgive them, they don't know.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. We're just out of time. I think Philippians 4 through 7. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. The next verse tells us to let our supplications be known unto God. So rejoice and pray. James 1. Look at James 1 for a minute, real quick. We're just out of time. James 1 says that there's actually something good that comes from having to deal with these kind of issues. James 1 verse 2, my brethren, James 1 verse 2, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations. I think the New American Standard there says various trials. When you fall into various trials, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. So actually, as I have to deal with these kind of conflicts and troubles, even physical sickness, if I do it right, I get stronger spiritually. And that's really what matters, right? That's the ultimate bottom line. So I had to go through this horrible round of physical illness. I mean, it was awful. But when it was over, I was stronger spiritually than I was when I started. It was worth it, right? I lost my job. I went through some real hard economic times. But at the end, I realized that I was stronger than I was when it started. It was worth it. Right? So what we usually say is, you go through these difficulties, it's going to have one or the other effect on you. It's going to make you weaker or stronger. If it makes you stronger, it was worth it. Right? And I believe that's the way we got to look at it. Finally, the last verse on that page, 1 Peter 4, beginning verse 12. Remember, if any man suffer as a Christian, Peter said, we should be thankful for that. We should be thankful that we have the opportunity to suffer for his cause. And we ought to look at it that way. All right. Thanks, everybody. Lord willing, we'll take the last lesson in this set next Sunday morning, lesson 13 in your study guide.